All right, I believe I will get started because we do have a hard time of 11 o'clock to release this room to the next group. I want to thank the National Bureau of Asian Research for partnering with us in setting this rollout up. I'd like to thank the National Press Club for hosting us here. In front of you, you have the team. I'll talk about them a little bit more. We have two students that are not with us right now that could not make it to this event due to other obligations at the Army War College. We have, you have the bios, but just a brief overview is we have 6 U.S. officers. We have 2 international fellows. As far as the U.S., we have a Navy represented on our group, and we have a DA civilian on our group. The report that we are rolling out, it's a little unusual in that we are going to roll it out at the end. The actual report is going to become available at the end of July, within a week or two, maybe the first part of August. But we did want to do the rollout while the students are here. It seemed like they needed the opportunity to get to express their thoughts to the group on their research, and they graduate on the 10th. And once they go to the WINS, we wouldn't be able to pull them back for the rollout in July or August. This briefing is being live recorded and live streamed, and therefore when we get to question and answer, I'll just ask you to speak into the mic and wait for the mic because we do want to capture all that. The War College plans to put a collage of 2 or 3 of these events together for our posting on our YouTube page sometime in the future. Last caveat, we produced this report under academic freedom that the Army War College operates under. It's not like a typical report that comes out of the Army where we're speaking with policy authority. We are students and faculty at a war college, and so we're the crazy professors that get to say things under academic freedom. We don't speak for the War College, we don't speak for the Army, and we don't speak for DOD. This is an independent study. All right, so I'll get started, and if I could, thank you. Jumping right in, this study is one of 5 that the U.S. Army War College is producing this year. They're called integrated research projects. They are student-led projects, and they were directed by the Chief of Staff of the Army, the former Chief of Staff of the Army, General Odierno. The notion here is to capture some of the fresh thinking that the War College student body brings to the national security dialogue and to bring the dialogue of the students up to the national security debate. Up until the students come to the War College, typically they're very tactical and operational focused, and we try to expand that expertise and tacit knowledge that they have into the national security strategy and policy realm. That being said, this is a fairly quick turn project in that the students are with the War College for about 10 months. We actually have been together for about 8 months, and we needed to get to the point that we are now in about 6 months in order to get the opportunity to roll this out and to have the paper go into publication and the peer review and editorial review prior to their graduation. So jumping right into the findings of the report, we came away with 3 key observations or insights. The first one is a little counterintuitive. We all look at the Asia Pacific and recognize that it's a maritime theater. Possibly not surprisingly from an Army War College perspective, we also find that it's very land-centric and land force-centric in the way that the security establishment of those countries operate. The second one is that the determinant dynamic of the competition between China and the United States in the region is in the gray zone. And we kind of define the gray zone as that space between war and peace. Activity, sometimes even coercive activity, that occurs below a threshold that would instigate a sustained combat or major combat operation response. and we find that the U.S. is not doing very well in that competitive space. And then the last observation is that culturally, possibly within the United States, but to stay focused on our findings within the U.S. Army and the U.S. Military land force community, we need to change our mindset and our perspective some if we want to compete well in that space. We have to understand it better. Next slide. So we had a couple of things here. The problem that we identified, as I mentioned before, is that the U.S. is not effectively countering China in their assertiveness in the gray zone. And tied very closely to that is we being the U.S., are not influencing the security environment of disorder within the Asia Pacific. That piece is important, as I'll get to in a moment, so that we can get some of our partners in the region to focus their attention and their security apparatus externally as opposed to internally. We came up with 4 categories of recommendations and 9 recommendations in all to address some capability gaps we identified. And then I'll jump to the top, which is the scoping criteria. This is both the scoping criteria for the project, and it became screening criteria for each one of those 9 recommendations. The first one is we identified the U.S.-China relationship as the most salient relationship in shaping the Asia-Pacific theater from a security standpoint. And so every recommendation had to address, directly or indirectly, the U.S.-China relationship. The second is that we are focused on this gray zone competition because we believe that that is the piece of the competitive environment that we're not operating well in. The third was a scoping issue associated with our expertise and where the expertise of land forces are. We recognize that the folks that are building con plans in theater and who are in theater having to execute those are in the best position to build those plans. There is very little we're going to do after 50 years in Korea, for instance, of providing a new insight into how we should conduct contingency operations in theater. We also recognize that we have a great deal of freedom as students and faculty to kind of break down the Weberian iron cage of bureaucracy. Very often a staff product has to work through many layers of bureaucracy and many traditions or the way we've always done it in order to see the light of day. We're not bound by that. So we thought that if we would look at what's new or unique in the environment and address that, that would be the place where we could find the most useful recommendations to our sponsors. And the last one is we felt like any recommendation has to be relevant across the range of military operations, from combat and deterrence to presence and engagement to just relationship building and networking. And we felt like that was important because most of our recommendations are focused on those relationships and networks and that presence and engagement. But if it doesn't have some relevance to a combat or deterrent mission, it's unlikely to get funded in the current fiscal environment. Next slide. This slide is basically an outline of the paper. It is also an outline of the briefing, and I plan to walk you through first some of the underlying foundations that established our perspective in the theory and scope. I'll very briefly talk about interests and challenges, opportunities. I've already talked about the problem statement, and we'll get into the capability gaps, and the majority of, or probably a third of the briefing will be to describe the recommendations. At the end, if we have enough time, I will get into implementation. For this group, that may not be the most salient point of the brief, but we do think that it's a unique branding of what we did with our report. Our sponsors were the commander of U.S. USAPAC and the headquarters Department of the Army G35 Strategy Policy Office. And for that reason, we knew we had practitioners as our sponsor. We wanted to offer those practitioners military and policy relevant implementation plans for each of the 9 recommendations. If we have time to get into that, I'll hit that. Next slide. So getting right into the meat of the briefing, there were 2 underlying theories or frameworks that guided our thinking. The first has to do with power transition theory. Dr. Lai, one of the co-leads, faculty leads, has written extensively on this and has identified that in power transition theory, the U.S. and China are in a power transition environment, and that it's unique and new since about 2008 is that we're moving into the second stage of the power transition. And the second stage is characterized by a more assertive China. As the rising power, they're feeling their national power. Their economy has grown since -- and they kind of came of age around the date is, not a hard date, but around 2008, 2009, when they hosted the Olympic Games. At the same time, the U.S. was going through an economic slump. And as you know from power transition theory, another author that writes on this is Graham Allison out of Harvard that recently wrote a Thucydides trap metaphor where he did case studies on 16 countries undergoing this power transition. Of those 16, 12 ended up in war. 4 successfully managed the transition, or the transition didn't happen, but they did not go to war. And our goal, our stated policy in both the U.S. and China is that we want to resolve this power transition. We want to make this transition smoothly and without war, finding peaceful means to do it. And that is that's our goal. We're in a very dangerous time, though, because as China becomes more assertive and is able to exert their will and not necessarily comport to the international norms that have been established by the status quo power of the United States, they are going to assert their will, and the U.S. is going to be, if we are like the other 16 countries in the case study, will be suspicious of some of those activities. And this is a time when miscalculation of the motives behind behavior can lead to war, and we need to avoid that. Next slide. So this gets into this gray zone competition. Both countries want to operate in this competitive space short of war. We want to operate in the gray zone. We want to resolve peacefully this adjustment of the international norms and international standards and how we relate to each other. And we found that this is a very difficult thing to describe and would take way too many pages. So Dr. Lai also provided the group with an analogy that seemed to work for us to describe the nature of the relationship and the competition in this gray zone. And that analogy is the Go game. It's a terrain board game with 19 squares where you use black and white stones, and the object of the game is to take as much terrain with your stones, fill as much of the board with your stones as possible. This is a good analogy for understanding the Chinese philosophy of competition in this zone, and it also highlights, when you contrast it with a game that's more familiar in the U.S., chess, what the difference in viewpoint and perspective of how we view competition. I've got 6 analogy insights here. I'm going to highlight 4 of them. The first one is the Go game is concerned with winning without fighting. And this is absolutely the nature of the gray zone. In chess, you take pieces, you win the game by attacking an opponent's pieces and removing them from the board. And finally, to get to a checkmate situation where you're in the position to take the king. Go doesn't operate like that. Go wins without fighting. The stones don't attack each other's position. It's a strategy game of where you position yourself and how you position yourself in that competitive environment. And the important point of the analogy for the real world is that this gray zone competition is much more about strategy and why we're doing things and how we're going about it than it is in any direct confrontation. The second one I'm going to point out is the stones of the Go game are of equal value. There's no special move that a stone can make, and frankly, once the stone is placed on the board, it never moves. Whereas in chess, you've got each piece has multiple capabilities to move around. The pawn is a weaker player to the queen that has many more moves available to it, to a rook that can be, or a knight that can have a ability to jump over players. The part of the analogy here for us is that the U.S. is very chess-centric. We like to see technology having some special capability that's going to solve our strategy challenges, whereas Go relies solely on the strategy, and there's no technology overmatch with the stones. I'll jump over the next one and get down to the multinodal initiative piece. In a chessboard, you use one strategy, and you can generally tell fairly early in the game which player is winning. In a Go game, it doesn't work like that. In a Go game, you can have areas of the board where one player is ahead or winning and successfully gaining terrain, or another area of the board, the opposing player can be winning. And this has, in the analogy to the real world, has a multi-dimensional aspect to it, not just a terrain aspect. So you have China-U.S. competition in the Americas, you've got China-U.S. competition in Africa, you've got China-U.S. competition in the Indian Ocean periphery states, and you've got U.S.-China competition in the Asia-Pacific. But in the third dimension, vertically, we've got competition in cyber and space, we've got competition in the economic and commerce world, and we've got competition in the security world. And we can be winning and losing in different places, both geographically and in the different instruments of national power. The final one, and this kind of brings us back to the win without fighting, is the nuanced notion of winning. Go ends up being virtually a win-win situation. The difference between a winner and a loser in Go is usually 3 or 4 stones amongst good players. So both teams walk away sharing power, sharing terrain, and the nuanced difference could be considered a win for both opponents. Whereas in chess, someone is a winner and someone is a loser, and the U.S. very often, particularly in the security or military realm, thinks in terms of victory, planting a flag in an opponent's capital, defeating an army, and that's just not a relevant concept in this gray zone competition. This slide is a transition slide that basically shows you how the Go game is being played on the terrain board of the Asia-Pacific. China is asserting themselves in the Asia-Pacific by building up terrain features and reefs on areas that they believe were taken from them in the distribution of terrain after World War II. And since World War II, other countries have built up similar formations and make similar claims to those territories. And this is really where the Go game gray zone competition is being played out in the Asia Pacific. Next slide. So we looked at challenges and opportunities, and I'll skim through these fairly quickly to get to the gaps. But the main challenge in this gray zone competition is the challenge over international norms and how we're going to settle these territorial disputes. And the rise of China and China wanting to revise some of those international norms, and the U.S. actually working its way through how those international norms should be appropriately changed to accommodate China's rise. In the South China Sea periphery states, we have a challenge with our partners in that many of those states are weaker states that have the tyranny of distance, where they can't extend their legitimacy of their central government out to the peripheries of their country. And at the peripheries of the country, they have a combination of their own disorder, their own corruption, or challenges of their own central government's power, combined with the non-state actors having an area where transnational organized crime, piracy, shadow governments and authorities can express themselves. The result of the combination of those two things forces many of our partners to be very internally focused on their internal issues and not externally focused, or being able to prepare their security forces to engage international norm enforcement within the region. The last challenge is the natural and man-made disasters, which particularly in the South China Sea, it's an area that's known for those. There are many of them, and that distracts an awful lot of security forces to the humanitarian assistance disaster relief mission that is necessary in the region. I will jump over the opportunities. Most of you are familiar with them, and go directly to the gaps. We identified 6 specific gaps in what is preventing U.S. land forces from engaging in this gray zone competition effectively. The first one is we identified that as part of our mindset, we don't have a good lexicon. We don't have a language for discussing this gray zone competition, and our methods of building campaign plans are designed more for contingency and combat than they are for gray zone competition. We recognize that the most important thing in developing a U.S.-China relationship is to have access to China to build that relationship, and we have several authorities issues with having direct mill-to-mill engagements with China, which we think would be vital in being able to establish a relationship and reduce the chance of misunderstanding with China. I've already spoken briefly about our nascent partner relationships and our access through presence, and the challenges our partners have with extending the legitimacy of their central government to their peripheries and dealing with some of their internal disorder challenges, which forces them to have an internal focus of their security apparatus as opposed to an external focus. The last 2 have to do with narrowing in the future, we will have a narrowing of this competitive space of the gray zone. And what we would like to see is more land-based cross-domain control to expand that gray zone space. And what I'm getting at here is right now the U.S. has a decisive advantage with maritime and air power, certainly, but also with land power in the Asia Pacific. As time goes on, that gap will narrow, and the threshold for going to war or to resolve a dispute with more kinetic lethal force goes up. To the extent that we can impose a cost for crossing that threshold, we can continue to have this greater space for competition below the threshold of war, which is what both countries want. And then the final one is limited land force maneuver in the maritime environment. For as much as we believe this is a land force-centric problem for gray zone competition in the Asia Pacific. This is a maritime environment. And the Army, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, and the Special Forces, if they don't have assured maneuver capability, any transnational organized criminal or pirate with a John boat can outmaneuver the most technical or sophisticated land force that is tied to the beach. This next slide just lays out the 4 categories of recommendations. I'll go through the recommendations quickly so that I leave time for discussion. That is, each of the students in front of you built or designed these recommendations and can give as much detail as is of interest to you. So the first one, we only have one recommendation under the rebalancing the mindset, although there's many ways to do this. The specific recommendation is to write a joint concept. And the joint concept would need to do several things, but key amongst them is to break down the myth, dispel the myth of this war-peace binary narrative that the West operates under. This chess analogy, where we are either at peace or when our interests are threatened severely enough, we break the glass, we bring the military out, we fight a war, and then we go back to peace. That's not the way the real world actually operates. And so the new joint concept would have to talk about managing the peace in this coercive space between war and peace. In order to do that, the second thing the joint concept would have to address is a new lexicon. Currently, our joint concepts talk in terms of deny, disrupt, defeat, deter, destroy. Those concepts, those terms are alien to this gray zone competition below combat. We need new words in order to advance notions of coordinate, cooperate, compete, coerce, confront, so that we can describe to each other both what it is we want to do, the objective of a campaign, and the ways that we're going to go about doing it. These are exemplars. I'm not advocating these specific words, but the notion is we need a language to talk to each other across not just the military, but the interagency in describing our objectives and describing our methodologies for achieving those objectives. The last one I'll talk to is this notion of strategic mindedness. Our commandant recently wrote a paper on strategic mindedness, and it talks about providing military advice within the context of an environment that is much more robust than the security environment. And this new concept, new joint concept that would talk about being able to compete in the gray zone must capture this notion of giving sound military advice that's informed by political, cultural, economic, and other contexts within which the competition is being engaged. Next slide. We have 4 recommendations that fall under the access and readiness through partnerships. And they're kind of they go from things that we're already doing to the things that we aren't doing to the things that we aren't doing that are tougher to do. So it's kind of a growing scale. Under the Pacific Pathways modification, we are making 2 very specific recommendations. Pacific Pathways, for those that don't know, is a concept where we are taking exercises that used to be disjointed in the PACOM theater, putting together 3 to 4 exercises in a series to get the efficiencies of going one time in a sweeping motion to do the 2 to 3 exercises with the same resources for transportation, logistics support, and training. And those are led by the U.S., and they're joint exercises. What we're recommending here is to do a reverse pathways where we encourage a regional partner to become the leader in the collective defense establishment by inviting them to run a Pacific Pathways in the opposite direction, to bring 2 or 3 nations in the region under the leadership of a cooperative defense lead to run 2 or 3 exercises coming from the Asia Pacific and ending up someplace on the West Coast, perhaps the National Training Center for a culminating exercise. The second one gets to this notion of having to have a direct relationship with China. Now, there's many places and many countries we can do that with. We're fortunate on our team to have a Mongolian officer who recognizes that the relationship between China and Mongolia is very strong. They have Chinese officers that attend their military institutions for their professional military education, and vice versa. And there are exercises that they have conducted with China in Mongolia. In fact, the U.S. has serendipitously participated in some of those humanitarian disaster relief tabletop exercises. We'd like to make this a more deliberate activity, and our recommendation in our report uses Mongolia as the exemplar, although they are by far not the only place where we think that direct engagement ought to occur. You're probably familiar with the State Partnership for Peace, but that is where National Guard units team with other countries to do partnership building and engagements for both cultural exchange pieces and for building partner capacity. We have shifted, or we have rebalanced to the Asia Pacific, and yet of the 76 partnerships that we have worldwide, only 8 of those partnerships are currently in U.S. PACOM. We believe all ASEAN nations need to have at least one state partnership alignment, if not more. So those are the 2 low-hanging fruit, easy-to-do, expanding current program projects. The second 2 are tougher. Currently, we do many civic action activities in conjunction with rotating forces into the theater or with the Navy when they do port calls. Any kind of build partner capacity type program, all the way to just engagements to familiarize folks in the region with who we are. Working with orphanages, digging wells, building irrigation, doing construction projects for infrastructure. These activities currently are very loosely managed. Our recommendation is that the military activities that were associated with this have to be rationalized and tied to a theater campaign objective and a goal so that we're more efficient and effective in how these operations play into each other and where we can build on previous successes. And we believe that we need to centrally coordinate, have a central coordination activity to do that. Our recommendation is that is USERPAC, but it could be any military activity in PACOM that would take on the mission of synchronizing, pre-approving these activities, and tying the rationale for conducting the activities to theater campaign plan objectives. That's actually tough, but not the toughest piece of this recommendation. The second piece has to do with the interagency and non-governmental organization activities and synchronizing those, or frankly, synchronizing the military activity with the activities of those interagency and NGO activities. In order to do that, for effectiveness of the overall international effort that the U.S. is putting forward, the military has to know what those are and find forums to harmonize those activities. That's a tougher nut to crack than the military one. The final recommendation in this set is building cooperative security locations. And cooperative security locations are nothing new, but the thing that's new about our recommendation is we're looking at these as almost a host nation warm basing facility. We would like to engage in logistics cost sharing development opportunities to build up ports and infrastructure to get between the ports and those cooperative security locations. We'd like to pre-position activity sets, and we'd like the host nations to have activity sets in the location, particularly humanitarian assistance, disaster relief related activities that could also be used for a flexible deterrent option for setting the theater. Things like medical, logistics, engineer facilities. Co-located with those sets, we'd like to have training facilities or training areas where we can do rotational force operations, where we can train and exercise with our host nation partner and bring in other nations from the region to do the same. Next slide. The next two slides, those of us that have the chess mindset will immediately go to major combat operations and see the applicability. Our report is on gray zone competition. And so the motivation for these recommendations being in the report are not related to the major combat operation benefit that they provide. Although, as with all of our recommendations, the last screening criteria is they have to be relevant across the range of military operations to include those high-end. This recommendation talks about cross-domain control from land bases. And that cross-domain control, the motivation for this recommendation in the report, has to do with expanding that gray zone area and the options and of activities that can go on in the gray zone without tripping into a major combat operation scenario. To the extent that you can build a cross-domain land-based cross-domain control, you can impose a cost on arrival for tripping into that major combat operation and open up the space to allow you both cooperative to coercive options that can resolve issues within the gray zone without making that trip. We have three recommendations that fall under this and then a suggestion for how they might be employed. The air control piece is primarily a capacity issue. The U.S. has the capability to do land-based air domain control, but we do not have the capacity to meet the demand worldwide, nor do we have the capacity to meet the demands of the future in the Asia Pacific. The sea-based control is specifically an anti-ship capability. The U.S. does not have an anti-ship capability, nor do we have a doctrine or a concept for land forces to use such a capability. We have identified in the report several existing capabilities that through a testing of the and development of that capability could be converted for a dual-use purpose of anti-ship, but that's never going to happen without a concept that says that land forces do this type of mission. The third one, which is cyberspace, is new territory. There's an awful lot going on here, and our biggest challenge in writing about this is almost everything that's going on here, because it's so new, is classified. But we know that our rivals around the world have some significant capability in this area. The U.S. has some significant capabilities in this area, but we have to rationalize some type of a concept that allows land forces to engage in all three of these competitive environments. And I'll leave the specifics of these to the Q&A. Next slide. The last recommendation is assured shallow water maneuver. And again, this has obvious combat operation significance. In a maritime theater, a land force that does not have this assured shallow water maneuver can't do what on land you would call division cav-like operations, conduct reconnaissance, conduct screening operations, security operations, conduct patrolling, interdict potential threats, or interdict, shape the movement of forces that might be approaching one of your flanks. Again, this is not the reason it's in our report. Our report is focused on the gray zone. It's absolutely vital in the region for land forces to have this assured shallow water maneuver capability to enforce international law norms and international law that has to do with anti-piracy operations, counter-corruption operations, interdiction of supply chains of human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, to be able to engage fishing fleets without bringing a gray hull upside a fishing trawler that might be violating agreements on these disputed territories. Next slide. With implementation, I'll only make 2 points on the implementation. We've got very specific ones for those that are the action officers that would have to implement them on the first 2 or 3 steps, but they kind of fall into the category of do more of what we're doing now, and that gets to the first couple of options that we have, or first couple of recommendations. There is a joint concept on integrated campaigning that does most of the things that we're talking about for mindset change. And our recommendation is that land forces get behind that joint concept and make sure we get it right, get the right words in there. On the Pacific Pathways and the expanding state partnership programs, that's also ongoing operations that we believe need to be expanded, and we need to advocate for that in our resourcing discussions. The biggest challenge to the synchronization is twofold. One is identifying who ought to be the lead synchronizer, and we believe that USERPAC, because it's a land-based, all the activities are land-based and population-based, it should be USERPAC acting as an agent for USPACOM. And we'll have to work over time the interagency synchronization once we get the military synchronization down. The cooperative security locations is a diplomatic effort to work with the host nations to find out who is willing. There are several nations that are intrigued by this concept. We've done a couple of red teaming exercises with partners from the region who don't speak officially, but they are intrigued by this concept. On the land-based cross-domain control, this is an issue of writing a joint concept for it. We have to believe from a civilian perspective, a DoD perspective, that this is an appropriate use of U.S. land power. And then from a military perspective, we have to write a concept that operationalizes this capability. We can't drive requirements documents. We don't even collect demand signals for what's needed for things that we don't have a concept to say that we have to do. And so the recommendation there is a concept. And then the shallow water maneuver follows the same path. For the final 2, we talk about near-term actions and long-term options. And the long-term option, particularly with the final 2, the land-based cross-domain control and the shallow water maneuver, is that the gap is a regional gap, not a U.S. gap, not a U.S. military joint force gap. Being a military guy or a former military guy, I know that our joint forces would like to have these capabilities resident within our formations. But it might well be that the option that we have to encourage is to develop these capabilities in our regional partners, either by developing the concept and taking the lead of how it could be employed and doing the development of the systems and selling it through foreign military sales, or by designing the concept and showing the benefit and then allowing or working with our partners to develop the capacity, the capability and the capacity to do these things in their own region. The advantage of having our partners do that is it will be viewed as a defensive measure, which is what the purpose of the recommendation is, whether the U.S. develops it or the regional partner develops it. But gaining access to the states where we'd like to deploy these things could very easily look like an act of aggression and precipitate one of these miscalculations that we talked about earlier. If our partners develop the capability and it's resident within their nations to defend themselves in the cross-domain control or to enforce international laws with the assured maneuver, the U.S. could always pick that capability up and produce it should we ever trip into that war category, but it's less likely to be provocative in the gray zone competition. And with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm a couple minutes over my target and open this to questions. I would remind you that this is being live cast, so please wait for the microphone and speak clearly when you ask the questions. And I'd also remind you that we have a hard time to be out of here at 11 o'clock. I'm not sure what time it is, but I hope it's not 11. Go ahead. Sir.
Okay. Lee Beaulieu, Voice of America. I have many questions, but I guess I just focus on the recommendation number 1. When you talk about new lexicon, deny, disrupt, those are the old ones, Ds. But coordinate, cooperate, compete, coerce, and confront. Now, if we look at the biggest gray zone competition right now, the South China Sea, it seems to me that the U.S. is already applying all those, the Cs, and then we have not done any Ds right now. Of course, we're talking about gray zone right now, but it doesn't seem that the situation is going our way. So what's going on? And it seems, again, they're doing your strategy, how to deal with the gray zone competition in South China Sea. Yet, we're seeing the trend is not favorable to us. So what's going on? Thanks.
Actually, you're making the point of the report, and unfortunately, that recommendation was proffered by me, so I have to keep talking. And the other ones were proffered by the students, so I will address this one. The gray zone competition is nothing new to the United States. As a matter of fact, there are many that write about gray zone competition and say that we wrote the book. And I agree with you. We are competing in the gray zone using the Cs. The problem is we aren't doing it as deliberately and as rationally as we could be. And the recommendation offers that we need a few things. We need a language in order to talk about this in a way that focuses our activity and our competition on that gray zone. Current language that we use in talking to each other in the joint force talks about contingency planning, phase 0 operations, typically that have to find some trigger, which means that we have to be in a reactive mode of doing something to prevent an escalation to a phase 3 combat operation. My suggestion is if we had a better language to discuss what we were trying to do, a better campaign design framework to talk about advantaging ourselves of opportunities in the region, we could be more proactive. And we could be more proactive in a way that would be seen, like the Go game, as a potential win-win and win without fighting. Where right now our language is so burdened by this contingency plan operation and the prevention of going to a phase 3 or to fight a phase 3 should one occur, that I think it makes us very ineffective in this area. And then the last one has to do with authorities. There are authorities that get triggered when you have a named or numbered operation that are going towards or trying to prevent an escalation to major combat operations. The PACOM commander does not have those authorities in a peacetime environment, and probably should not have all of them. But there should be a mechanism by which he can request them in a more transparent and quicker turn way than he does now, to have access to, for instance, National Guard forces or equipment that are in the area operating under, that he does not have access to short the execution of a named operation. Next question. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you. In the challenge opportunity gaps, Vietnam and Mongolia are mentioned. So I wonder if your Vietnamese and Mongolian colleagues can talk about that, what the opportunities from your point of view that you can provide to the United States to maintain regional security. And then I don't know if someone can talk about the military relations with China, because that's the second one identified as GAP, restricted male-to-male relationship. What are the restrictions right now that prevent us to do what we need to do? Thanks.
I'll pass it to you two first, and then Sonny, if you'd think of an answer to that last question, I'd appreciate it.
Mongolia is important in this context in two ways. The first is Mongolia has good relations with both US and China, and we do not have any dispute, any disagreement with China as well. The second, Mongolia is willing to support US to engage with China more constructive ways. In a sense, Mongolia can be the best candidate to enhance defense cooperation with of the US and China by hosting exercises and exchanges, which is essential in building mutual confidence and which is also help avoid miscommunication and miscalculation in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so for Vietnam's case, we see the opportunities that Vietnam can help to provide the stability in the regions. And you see the Vietnam-China relations has up and downs in history, have a good, close relation with each other, had the fighting in the border, had problems with the seas. But the fact is that Vietnam and China could find out a way to talk with each other to resolve the problems. And Vietnam and China actually had finished the land demarcation in the north of Vietnam in the border with China. And the two countries also marked the demarcation or delimitation for the Gulf of Tonkin. So also we have lots of problems. Vietnam and China have problems, but they can seek out a way to talk, to negotiate. So this is a peaceful settlement for the issue. No use of the military in here. So that's my point.
Hi, Colonel Sonny Lee. For your question related to our issues with exercises and engagement with China, is the policies that exist that prevents us from conducting direct exercises and engagements with the Chinese military. However, in the past few years, we were able to participate in humanitarian assistance exercises, as was in the case off of not on mainland China, but on Hainan Island. So there is progress. The USPAC commander went out a few times and have engaged with their leaders to break ground, I guess is the way we want to call it. But the issue is the policies that exist that prevents us from conducting direct engagements and exercises.
Other questions? Sir.
Thank you. Roy Camphausen with NBR. I really look forward to reading the final product. It's some great analysis and recommendations. I see in the second to last set of recommendations echoes of the CSBA study that talks about kind of a U.S. Tailored packages of A2AD. I guess the commentary here, or the question that comes to mind is, in a sense, we inadvertently validate the Chinese concept by applying it ourselves in response. And I'm wondering about the action-reaction cycle that might lead to over time. But the more, I guess there I really wanted to ask a question about is the recommendation 9, shallow water maneuver. It's a fascinating concept. I don't know if it's still the case, but years ago when I was on active duty, the Army actually had more waterborne craft than the Navy and Coast Guard together. So it's not an entirely foreign concept. But if you could maybe talk a little bit about the kind of internal messaging that will have to take place within DoD for this sort of concept to be adopted. I mean, is our Navy friend, are you going to be welcome to go back to the fleet, or are you going to have to find home at USERPAC?
Sonny, if you want to field the first question on the provocation nature of your recommendation, and then, Pepe, you can dive into the,
When we were thinking about the lily pad concept, and as you mentioned, tit for tat or doing this because they're doing that, one of the biggest things that we saw was the fact that they were mentioning that, yes, we are doing that already with our naval vessels and aircraft, but it's not persistence, the issue of persistence. And so we need persistence, but at the same time, giving us more options from the range of military operations that we could eventually go to. So when we looked at the lily pad concept, we thought without doubt that we are preventing the Chinese from having no basically persistence, because we're bringing capability and stationing it there for a permanent time, whether it's a week, a month, whatever. So that gives assurance to our partners and allies in the region, as well as ourselves, to our forces, our joint force, that, hey, we are providing a force protection capability as required, but at the same time, not so high that it's going to escalate. So it's tailorable to the needs at the time. And at the same time, the biggest thing is it's gray zone competition. We don't want to escalate to the level at which you're talking about.
So I'd just add on there too that you highlighted a very critical part in the action reaction is that this gray zone, what kind of defines it is the cost of not doing something is equal to the cost of doing something potentially. So by the same token, you have to look at it and say, well, what if we don't do that? Then what happens? Then we potentially in the future have no access to a certain area. So those are all things that we took into consideration and weighed. As far as the assured maneuver in the shallow water environment, I would say that I haven't been in the Navy for almost 4 years now. I've been joint purple. And hopefully they do allow me to go back in there. But I think what the way we looked at this, as Trey mentioned, it's not necessarily a Navy or an Army-centric thing. It is a joint force and a regional requirement. It's a capability that is lacking. And as far as our recommendation goes, is somebody needs to pick up the slack. The Navy, we typically tend to focus on blue water. Is where we are primarily involved, deep water, and we have a tendency to stand up shallow water forces when we need them, all the way back from, you can go back as far as you want, and we've stood up riverine forces and bring them down. We stand them up during Vietnam, we bring them down. In 2005, we stood them up for Iraq. In 2007, we stood them down, kind of thing. We do have a limited capability in the Navy still. We certainly have special forces that have patrol boats that do this kind of thing, but as far as moving, land forces, as Trey mentioned, think of of a Stryker vehicle moving forces around tactically to encounter and flanks and ISR for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, not to mention the amount of population that live along riverbanks in the Asia Pacific. And not just Southeast China or South China Sea, but into India, etc. So it's going to take a different look. Somebody's got to buy onto it, and we're just hoping that somebody does. And if, as you mentioned, this was a capability that actually the Army did have during Vietnam. They did have riverine forces, so it's been throughout the services. We're just saying somebody needs to pick it up. If it's the Navy, good to go. If it's not, somebody needs to provide that force or that capability for our land forces.
Let me just add one thing to both of those responses. You mentioned the one study, the other one RAND conducted on the anti-ship capability in the region. And the key point that both folks made is that we're not saying exactly what the long-term option is that the U.S. ought to choose for fielding this capability. we're identifying these as absolutely critical gaps for competing well in the gray zone as regional military gaps. And the fact is that if the U.S. does not take the lead in taking the first step, which is building a concept of how to employ this, it won't happen. We'll have these, inter-service discussions prior to ever fielding or doing anything with the combat patrol boat, for instance, and we will not develop the anti-ship capability, either us in our land forces or when we red team this with our regional IFs in land forces that don't have that. So when we take a look at the region, the RAND study points out that some of our partners are developing this capability, Japan, for instance. There are a couple other partners that are develop or have a capability, a fairly short-range capability, Indonesia and Malaysia, for instance, but they're not necessarily looking to share that capability with the U.S. On the combat patrol boat, primarily as an economic reason, and because they are a land-centric force, they have invested in combat patrol boats as a cost-efficient way of having their land forces enforce some of their maritime jurisdiction issues. When our recommendation is pretty clear that what we need to do as the U.S. is develop the concept for employing this, probably develop the capability so that we have the technology and the capability, and that it very well could be that the folks that employ this capability will be our partners, either through us selling it to them or them developing and fielding a capability that is indigenous to their nations. But without the U.S. lead, without the U.S. military lead saying this is a land force relevant issue that is a gap in the region that needs to be filled, and building a concept in conjunction with our partners and doing JCTDs to test different ways of employing the systems and what systems might be dual purpose to it, it is very unlikely that our partners will undergo those steps themselves. So the notion, we fully recognize the notion of being military folks, we'd like to build a capability for ourselves and have it in our arsenal. Our recommendation is that that is a future decision, that it does not need to be taken now. But doing nothing means that there won't be an option in the future to do anything. And so we feel like we must take a step now to recognize the gap, build a concept and potentially even the capability to fill that gap, and probably in the future help our partner nations realize the capability for their own defense. Another question? Yes, sir.
Wayne Burt. I'd just like to get a sort of a capsule statement of what the objective is in this gray zone competition. You talked about in GO, the objective is to collect more pieces on your side, your color. I'm not quite sure how that translates into foreign policy or military goals in this gray zone competition. So if you could just state in as specific a terms as possible what you have in mind and how it differs from what's being done now, what U.S. objectives are at the current time.
Does anybody want to field that, or you want me to volunteer? I'll give you my 2 cents and do it in the quick blast, and then see if anybody wants to add on. The number one U.S. goal is to influence the international order and the way disputes are settled around the world, but particularly with the terrain disputes in the Asia Pacific. The second is that we want to accommodate either a peaceful transition of power between the U.S. and China, or an accommodation of China as a co-power, or the accommodation of China as a rising power for another 50 or 100 years without going to war. That is We're not offering anything new about what our objectives are, and frankly, that's the policy goal of China as well. So the objectives are not different. It is peaceful transition or peaceful coexistence with China, influencing the international order to resolve these disputes short of war. What our suggestion is that though we, as the gentleman in the back of the room suggested, while we're doing many things to advance those national interests and those national objectives, we're not doing very well. And our recommendations are to provide a toolkit to offer options to our civilian leadership and to our partners in the region to do it better.
How would you describe that toolkit, just in a few sentences?
Engagement with partners to have access in the region, to be influential through being with our partners, and to provide options for how we can do everything from coordinate and cooperate with China, like the mill-to-mill relationships, to compete or confront China with a patrol boat that might engage a Chinese fishing fleet that is violating a fishery in some way that has not been negotiated in an international forum.
We have a response from there too.
I'm Virginia Gertie. And actually, what your comment goes to one of my comments and maybe into a question, but it sounds like by offering a new toolkit, new tools, a new way to look at things so that it's not just at war or not at war, you're saying here are some other ways you can go about creating relationships, creating capital and conversations and information pathways that will hopefully prevent going to war. So things like being able to exchange information, maybe have some interoperability among the different countries' equipment, not just military equipment, but civilian equipment for disaster response. So you're really looking at, I see it as more of an opportunity of things for us to go above and beyond just fighting a war. So that when the US has presence, and there are articles about the US doing things in Mongolia, Taiwan, Vietnam, wherever it may be, it's not, oh, we must be going to war with them soon. People will see that as we're just really increasing that relationship and providing some structure, maybe the leadership for that interoperability.
Virginia's got about the right thing. Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, we want to be one of the 4, not one of the 12. One of the 4 that manages this transition peacefully than one of the 12 that doesn't. But I'm not sure I'm getting at I'm not sure I've nailed your question with my answer.
I think another piece is deterrence through presence. You know, the gentleman in the back alluded to, we're doing different things. We're doing freedom of navigation operations, and it's not slowing them down at all. But when there's physical U.S. presence in an area, it deters people. It increases the cost of action. Take an example, we move to Australia. They lease it for 99 years to run the marine facility in Australia. So it is just putting people in different places. Could help increase transparency, but I think ultimately what deters one another is having our presence there. You know, whether it's their presence over here, our presence over there, et cetera. It just elevates the cost, and I think that eventually de-escalates. And all of our recommendations, while they have military implications in the end, you know, they help build those relationships, put our presence in the area, land force presence in the area, that then increases cost of doing something that may escalate from gray zone to all-out conflict kind of thing.
And Pepe's speaking specifically for his, assured shallow water maneuver. The other category was the access through presence of the other groups. That is 100% towards building those relationships, reducing the chance of misunderstanding, resolving conflicts, and working together in ways that can enforce standards that have been established in some international forum. I still don't know if I got to your, I'm not sure I'm scratching your itch, so if you want to repose that question again in another way, I'll take another shot at it. Does anybody have another question? Sir.
Hi, Richard White, Hudson Institute. Many of your recommendations seem to be very low cost, at least in monetary cost. I wasn't sure if that was a deliberate effort given where we are in terms of budgetary constraints, and if you relax whatever assumptions you had about that, whether there would be more things you'd like to do if you had additional money. Think of it as like the Air Force wish list. If they could get extra funding, what they would go after.
I'll answer that for the implementation chapter. That happens to be one of our students who's not present with, or two of our students that are not present with us. We specifically address that, and we are informed by the fiscal realities of, the foreseeable future. And so there are two pieces to our recommendation. All of our near-term actions that we recommend are low cost. It's mostly thinking. It's mostly understanding. It's mostly writing concepts about how we can approach this problem set differently, since the current way we're approaching the problem set is not producing the results that we desire. So all of our near-term actions are very low cost. Some of them, we're looking for burden sharing, cost sharing, for instance, the security cooperative locations. And we wouldn't change that because we think the benefit of having that be partner-led, partner skin in the game, partner-owned capabilities or locations and training areas and leadership in collective defense has great benefit. And to the extent that the U.S. leads it, it undermines the ability of our partners to grow, and it's provocative to China. And so even if we had more money, we wouldn't change that recommendation. Now, some of them, like the Assured Shallow Water Maneuver and Cross-Domain Control, we know today that we have a capacity problem with the air domain. We know today that we don't have a capability in the anti-ship domain. All of our recommendations for near term are to develop the concept of how that ought to be done and to socialize the notion that there are many reasons why you should do that from a land-based platform. And the near-term piece of that is fairly inexpensive. In the longer term, if we chose a far-term option or a longer-term option of developing that capability internally to the joint force, the U.S. joint force, it would have an impact. The fiscal constraints that we're currently operating under would not support building that capability, or we have already done it. Next, anyone have a? Well, I'm sorry. I believe that we've culminated, and we're a good 5 minutes to clear the room for our guests. So to be a leisurely walk out the door. No one has to knock each other over, but good luck getting back out there. It's a nice day. I hope the Metro's back up, and thank you very much for your attendance.